Hi guys, and welcome to another video of my BFME2 guide. Today we are finally going to tackle the mystery behind buffs, leadership, debuffs and everything related to it. Some of you might be watching and thinking, mystery? What mystery? But believe me when I tell you that over 90% of all players are not using the system to its fullest potential. I hope, however, to change all of that with this video. Before we begin, I would like to point out that there are different stats and numbers for each version of the game. I will be using the ones from 1.09 in this video. However, 1.06 boys, don't click away just yet. The numbers might be different, but the way things work are almost identical. So I highly recommend that you guys watch this video as well. If you understand it on 1.09, you will be able to figure it out on 1.06 too. Remember, no one in the world is making more mistakes related to this stuff than 1.06 community. This guide will consist of two videos. In this one, we will be looking at all the different ways you can buff your units. In part 2, the exact opposite. I will explain all the different debuffs and how they work. With all of that being said, let's get started. Before I can get to the actual numbers, I would like to explain what a buff is. A buff is an improvement. So everything that improves the abilities of your units is a buff. Whether it makes them faster or do more damage or see farther away, all of that is considered a buff. I would like to note that heavy armor upgrade, forged blades upgrade, fire arrows and silverthorn arrows are no buffs, because those upgrades don't improve the abilities of your units but rather their weapons and chainmail. So I will not be talking about these types of upgrades in this video. There are 5 unit characteristics that can be buffed. Let's take a look at those right now. The first and most important one is armor. It makes your units more resilient and harder to kill. Second one is damage, which makes your units deal more damage. Third is experience. This one makes your units level up faster. Next one is speed. It allows your units to move at a higher pace. And the last but not least is the vision buff, which improves the range at which your units can see and shoot. The majority of this video will be about armor and damage. I will not be talking about experience because it doesn't come as a standalone buff. It always comes with either damage or armor buff. So let's take a look at all the different types of armor and damage buffs that are in this game. Once again, just a reminder, these numbers are based on 1.09. The first type is the simple armor buff. This is the one which gives your units 50% armor, also known as double armor. The following will give you this type of buff: Elven Wood or Tainted Land, Faramir Leadership, Gimli Leadership, Dwarven Statue and Gorkil Skull Totem. There are 2 unique ones that also fall into this category but are slightly different. First one is Eomer Leadership. It is basically the same buff as all of the above, but the only difference is that it only affects cavalry. The second one is the Drummer Troll Leadership. It gives your units 50% armor like all the others, but it also gives an additional 15% armor to trolls. Next up is Simple Damage buff. So this one gives your units 50% damage increase. The following will give you this type of buff: Rallying Call, Theoden Leadership, Boromir Leadership, Haldir Leadership and Lourdes Leadership. There is also one slightly unique one in this group, and that is War Chant. It works exactly the same as Rallying Call, however the numbers are slightly changed on 1.09. Instead of 50, it gives you 40% damage and 10% speed. However, it still falls into this group and will stack exactly the same. More about stacking later on. Next type is the small armor buff. It basically gives your units 25% more armor. There are only 3 things that give this type of buff: Man Heroic Statue, Arwen Leadership and Gorkil Leadership. Moving on to small damage buff. Basically the same as armor buff, but this increases your damage instead. The following will give you this type of buff: Man Fortress Banners Upgrade, Dwarven Fortress Banners Upgrade, Elven Fort Crystal Moat Upgrade, Mordor Fort Doom Pyres Upgrade, Battle Wagon with Banner Carrier Upgrade, Elven Heroic Statue, and Summoned Lone Towers. However, this one requires the Banners upgrade to be already purchased. Next up is High Tier Leadership. This one provides your units with both 25% armor as well as 25% damage at the same time from the single leadership. So who do we get this from? Aragorn Leadership, Elrond Leadership, Elven Tom Bombadil Leadership, Dane Leadership and Saruman Leadership. A quick note about Saruman. Saruman does have a leadership, even though there is no icon showing it, unlike with all the other heroes. So to summarize, we have now covered 5 different types of buffs. Simple armor buff, which gives 50% armor, simple damage buff, which gives 50% damage, small armor buff, which gives 25% armor, small damage buff, which gives 25% damage, and the final one is high tier leadership, which gives 25% armor as well as 25% damage. Now some of you probably noticed by now that I didn't name all the buffs that are available in the game. That is because the rest have some unique numbers or features to them. So let's take a look at those now. First up we have Treebeard. Both his leadership and who it affects are very unique. Treebeard leadership only affects ants. He provides them with additional 25% armor, 10% speed and 20% range increase. Obviously it doesn't stack with anything in terms of armor or speed because Treebeard is the only unit in the game who can buff ants. Farsight however will give additional range bonus to the ants and it will stack with range increase received from Treebeard leadership. Next up we have Charcot leadership. At first glance, Charcot leadership looks like an ordinary high-tier leadership. However, there are two main differences. One of them is obvious, his leadership only affects cavalry. The second one, however, is not that obvious at all and pretty much unknown to most of the community. Charcot leadership stacks with absolutely everything. I will be explaining how stacking works and why this is so unique later in this video. The next one I left out is probably the most familiar to you all, the Eye of Sauron. This one is unique for one simple reason, because it stacks with everything. You can always cast Eye of Sauron on top of any other buff, and it will increase either damage or armor or both, depending on what other buffs are being combined. Darkness is the next unique type of buff. For starters, unlike any other buff out there, it gives 50% damage as well as 33% armor to normal units. Those numbers are huge compared to any other buff. On top of that, it also gives 25% damage and 33% armor to monsters. Oh, and did I already mention that it stacks with everything? Basically the most versatile buff in the game. Next up we have Mighty Rage. It is the level 4 Dane spell. A very nice and unique spell that gives 25% damage increase as well as 20% speed increase. Now that's not all, it also works as a debuff if casted on enemy units. More on debuffs in part 2. Another unique feature of this spell is the fact that it works on heroes too, even flyers. It also stacks with everything. And the last but not least unique buff is Glorfindel level 10 spell Starlight. It buffs your units with 50% damage as well as 50% armor. It also heals nearby units and stacks with every damage buff in the game. Those were all the armor and damage buffs available in the game. Before we move on to stacking, I would like to quickly mention some standalone speed and vision buffs. First up is Palantir. Now everyone knows that Palantir is a very handy power to see what your opponent is doing. However, using Palantir on your own units will speed them up as well as reveal the same amount of terrain. Palantir is the only power point that gives you a speed buff as a standalone thing, unlike Mighty Rage and War Chant. On the topic of speed, Ivory Tower gives also a speed buff to all units on the map when used. Could be handy as an escape or an accelerated rush. And the final buff that I want to talk about is Farsight. Like Palantir, Farsight can be used to reveal terrain. However, if used on your own units, it will allow them to see and shoot longer distances. Obviously, it only works on units with ranged weapons. So far, we have looked at all the different buffs that are in the game. So now we have arrived at the topic where most of the things go wrong. Stacking. What is stacking? Stacking means combining different buffs together. An easy example of this would be using Elven Wood and Rallying Call on the same unit. This way you would combine the 50% armor that you get from Elven Wood with the 50% damage from the Rallying Call. Simple enough, right? There is only one problem though. Not all buffs stack with one another. Remember the different groups I made? So how it works is that you can only combine buffs from different groups. So buffs from the same group will not stack. Let me give you an example. Theoden leadership cannot be combined with any other simple damage buff, whether it's Rallying Call, Boromir leadership or even War Chant. You can use it on your units, but it will be a mistake because you won't get any extra damage from that. Surprisingly enough, this mistake is made a lot even by experienced players. Another thing that people should be aware of is the fact that armor has a buff maximum of 75% and it won't go any higher. Damage on the other hand has no limit. As long as the buff stacks, damage will add up. Now don't let that fool you though. Damage scales very differently compared to armor. 75% armor is equal to 300 damage. So what this means is that you would need to combine 5 or more damage buffs to get anywhere near that. This is why you should always prioritize armor over damage when given the choice. This is where I will end this video. In part 2 we will be taking a look at all the debuffs in the game and how they work. I really hope I made this clear for you guys, but if not you can always ask questions in the comment section or on gamereplays.org under this video. As I mentioned before, I will be making a guide on stances which will expand upon some of the subjects in this video. For now, just learn the different types of buffs we covered in this video and play around with different stances. I would like to thank Ictelion for explaining to me how most of this stuff works, as well as providing me with a map for testing. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did, subscribe for more. My name is Snowblack and I'll catch you all next time.